Hello everyone, we might kick off. Welcome to the webinar on child-centred disaster risk reduction impacts on household safety. My name's Kate McFarlane and I'm a research advisor with Save the Children's Asia Regional Office. Please don't be confused by the name I'm using on Skype for Business today. I'm on my colleague's account, Manaz Rabbani, but it is Kate here, I can assure you. This webinar is being hosted by the Asia Learning from Research webinar series, and this is an initiative out of the Asia Regional Office. Today I'm joined by two of the researchers, Dr. Marla Petal from Save the Children and Dr. Matalina Tofa from the University of Macquarie in Sydney, Australia, and I'll introduce them shortly. Just before we get started, some housekeeping, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. Also, there's an instant messenger box which you're free to use to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar. We will be having a Q&A time slot at the end of the webinar, so you'll also be able to ask questions then. The presentation will go for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and with that Q&A after. And just before we get started, it'd be great to know who's on the call. So if you could write your name, the organisation you're with, and the country you're joining from just in the instant messenger box there, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So just to provide you with some brief context, this project is part of a larger research program supported by the CNA Foundation, CNA and Save the Children Switzerland. In 2016, Save the Children conducted a scoping study looking at the gaps in child-centred risk reduction and school safety, and they found that there were three broad themes where there were gaps in evidence and guidance, and you can see those themes in the left-hand column on the screen in the dark blue shading there. And this research topic falls under that last theme on solutions for child-centred risk reduction and school safety. So why is this topic so important? Well, research has shown that children are often harmed during and following disasters due to ineffective planning and decision-making by their parents and guardians. Therefore, to effectively reduce risks, child-centred risk reduction programs that positively influence household decision-making and behaviour are needed. There's a lot of these programs out there and many case studies on such programs, but how do these programs influence action in the home? How they actually do that hasn't really been investigated. So Dr. Erin Crescetti, Dr. Matalina Tofa and Dr. Marla Petal were commissioned by Save the Children to design a toolkit that could be used to gather data on the impact that students have on their household safety, specifically in relation to if and how they share information learned through child-centred risk reduction programs with their caregivers, and if and how this information is then used to reduce risk in their respective households and communities. Before I hand over to Marla and Matalina, just to let you know from the larger research program, all the findings are coming through, and those findings will begin to be shared through the Save the Children network, but also publicly up on the GADRS website, as well as a number of other websites, and you can see the GADRS website address up there. So there'll be many resources and tools. To name a few, there'll be reports and summaries, research into action briefs and summaries, and case studies. So please keep an eye out for them. So at this point, I'll hand over to Marla and Matty.
Okay, I think I'm up here. We just wanted to give you a quick outline of what we're going to try to cover, and there's a lot to get in here. So we'll try to be brief and quick with all of the highlights and give you a chance to then digest some of that and ask your questions. Okay, so first of all, on acknowledgments, which is probably the next slide. We wanted to thank Dr. Crocetti, who is not with us today and has been had some personal things that she's had to deal with. So Maddie and I have taken over from her lead, but very much want to appreciate her. And we especially want to thank our teams in Bangladesh, India, and China who tested these tools and really gave them a working out. So I don't know if we have any of them with us today. I think maybe we do from Bangladesh, but that would certainly enrich it if we do catch them online. Okay, and next. So we both started and ended with putting together a concise literature review on child-centered risk reduction impacts on household safety, which is quite a mouthful and is actually quite a wide-ranging research effort, because what we were looking at in general is how do children's let's say public health education or education programs in general impact households. What can we really expect in terms of something that we do with children then making its way home? We also had to look at what we meant by household safety so that we could see if it was impacted. And then we were really looking at trying to understand programmatic choices and quality issues when it comes to what we actually do in the field. So this is really all about practice-based research in order to improve practice, right? So when it comes to children's impacts and salience, what we found is really consistently in the research literature that yes, children think that disaster risk reduction is important. Anyone that's been affected by it, even seeing it in the news, they actually realize that this is something of significance. So that's been a strong finding that children are interested. We also know that risk reduction itself, going to the Hyogo Framework for Action, and before that, the Sendai Framework for Action, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and before that, the Hyogo Framework, that children are considered real contributors to and enhance the quality of all of the efforts that take place in risk reduction. There's quite a lot in the literature, however, that says that we tend to look at children's abilities in terms of the knowledge that they've gained, and we tend not to measure any of that by the action that either they're involved in or the actions that their households have taken. So that's seen as a gap. There's a lot of literature on this, what's called bidirectional influence, which refers to both children's impacts on adults and adults' impacts on children. And often we find that the children coming home with something actually begin a dialogue with the parents, in which the parents are not just simply sort of tabula rasa and, taking in whatever the kids have learned in school, but there's actually, dialogue, and it goes in both directions. And then that gives the parents opportunities to also share more with the children. So what we found is that there are some active ingredients, though, for enhancing the impact of child-centered programming on household safety. And some of those active ingredients are, first of all, that the education itself really be interactive and engaging. So it's not just the sort of talking to and talking at children. It's not just telling them about hazards and that sort of old-fashioned science education, but getting them engaged themselves in an active way. In fact, it makes a big difference if we actually guide children to talk with their parents. And it makes a big difference if we send social and behavior change material home with children. So those are two really essential ingredients. We can't just assume that these things happen by osmosis. Oh, we taught kids something in school, so it'll magically find its way home. And the quality of children's learning is also quite important. If children really absorb and understand the response-related protective behaviors and gain competency in those, that seems to have a significant impact. In terms of measuring household safety, we've found that basing our approach on the public awareness and public education key messages, which are themselves rooted in evidence-based research, and which allow us to do something that we know is really important for household safety, which is achieve consensus in the guidance materials. One of the things that we've seen from multiple research studies is that if people tell householders to, different groups tell them to do different things, they basically just get confused and they don't want to do anything. But if the messages are really, really consistent, and if people feel that these measures that they're going to take are going to have a positive impact, and if they feel empowered and able to actually effectively do them, then they will. So that finding is also important for us to hold on to. Similarly, in order to measure whether we're making any progress, the literature suggests that we not use just an all or none approach. Have you done it or haven't you done it? Instead, we use a stages of behavior change approach. And although there's a bit of controversy around how predictable these things are and how much you can differentiate your approaches depending on the stage that people are at, it is consistent that people go through stages of, A, not knowing anything about the thing, B, having heard about it, C, planning to do something, D, doing it, and E, maintaining it. So if we can see them move from never having heard about it all the way to maintaining it, and if we can kind of get the nuances in between, we will also be able to know whether we're making progress and whether we're finished or not. So those have all been really important findings. And then finally, we know that, there are all these programmatic choices, and then there are issues of fidelity and quality. Yes, we have to do a whole range of activities. We're not sure what they are and which ones make the most difference. We know that training is important. We haven't figured out how to measure quality. And we know that social and behavioral change education materials are important, as opposed to what we used to call them information and communication materials. So that's that in a nutshell, but I think is important as you learn more about how we design these tools. And the bottom line is we don't have many answers to all those last things under program quality. And then there are our research questions, which should pop up with another click. And we can just pop them all up because we're going to just say, we were quite ambitious in our research questions, and I'm just going to say that we have not answered all the research questions entirely, but we've made some progress. We want to know what the theories of learning and behavior teach us. That's what I've just gone over with you. We want to know what program design elements are critical. We know some of them, but not all of them. What kinds of educational content for DRR are most highly associated with retention and action? We haven't learned a lot about that yet. We haven't even been able to fully differentiate the educational content. What kinds of teaching and learning approaches? I think similarly, we're really just on the edges of being able to describe and document the different things that we do. And then we have made a lot of progress, I think, on the toolkit, and Maddie's going to tell you more about that. Over to you, Maddie.
Cool. Thank you, Marla. So when designing the toolkit, there were several factors that were taken into consideration. So the first was that it was designed to evaluate CCDRR programs. And so the questions reflect some of the findings from the literature review, standardized checklists for household preparedness, curriculum, and previous research. It's also really important to ensure that the questions were reliable, that they have validity, and that they're also flexible, so that the questions the toolkit itself can be adapted for different programs and to be used in different countries. Lastly, it was important to make sure that the language used in the toolkit was really clear and that the questions were as specific as possible so that the answers are meaningful, and that the language used kind of avoids jargon or overly technical terms. In terms of the design process, while the toolkit was being developed, it was reviewed by multiple organisational representatives, particularly from Save the Children, and revised. It was also reviewed by academic researchers. As the toolkit's been used and tested, it's been revised and refined and localised again for each site as well. So in the toolkit, the topics covered include participation in risk reduction and resilience programs and the kind of training or information that's been received or learned, participation in household, school and community activities such as planning or response preparedness, perceptions of levels of preparedness and knowledge, and the sharing of information within families and within communities. The toolkit includes 7 modules, and so the first 5 modules provide guidance on how to use the toolkit, and with particular attention to some of the ethical issues around doing research with children and ensuring informed consent from children and their caregivers. The 6th module contains 4 questionnaires, which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment, and the final module provides some additional references and resources. And so of those 4 questionnaires, the first one is for key informants or the programming agency, so the organisation that's run the child-centred risk reduction programme. And that questionnaire includes such topics as the hazards that are in the area, the key features of the programme, the target groups, so was it urban or rural, what age, and which adults were targeted as well. And it also provides some information about the content, so what was included in the programme itself. And there are separate questionnaires for students or children and their caregivers and parents. And so these questionnaires cover some demographic information, hazards around information seeking and sharing, and which materials they've seen or read or used, and the disaster planning, the hazards that they know of in the area, actions they've taken at a household level, and their learning knowledge and confidence. And lastly, there's a questionnaire for teachers, and so this also includes quite similar topics to the previous questionnaire, but it also asks questions about the training that teachers have received around risk reduction and creating a culture of safety, and provides some questions around feedback from students and parents about the risk reduction programs that they've run. So the first place that the toolkit was tested was in Bangladesh, and that sample was 30 students, 30 caregivers and 4 teachers, all of whom had participated in a child-centred risk reduction program. And they're from 3 regions in Bangladesh, I think 1 rural and 2 urban. And so from using the toolkit, it was shown that all the caregivers and students had either talked with or taken action with their families related to hazards, risk and risk reduction. When looking specifically at students, it showed that 70% had spent between 3 to 10 hours on seeking or sharing DRR information, but students were less likely than caregivers to be familiar with standard operating procedures for things like building evacuations, but they were more familiar than their caregivers with SOPs that are taught in schools, so things like stop, drop and roll or drop, cover and hold. And 86% of students think they would be safe in an emergency. With the caregivers, they were more likely to respond about possessing knowledge on where disaster plans were in place than students. And interestingly, although only 13 caregivers identified their children as a source of information on hazards, all caregivers said that they felt they were prepared for hazards because of information they had learned from their children, which really shows information sharing within families as well. And next, the toolkit was also tested in China. In this sample, we had 46 students, 49 caregivers, and 16 teachers from 3 prefectures. And this sample is split into 2 groups. So the first group is the intervention group, which is students that had participated in a child-centred risk reduction program. and their caregivers and teachers, and then also a control group that hadn't participated in a risk reduction program. And so overall, through the testing of the toolkit, we could see the interest and capacity of students and their parents in terms of household safety and participating in disaster risk reduction. And so students in both the control and intervention group reported seeking and sharing information, and many of the comments from parents showed that they were really, really interested in knowing more about household safety and school safety as well. We found that students who had participated in a DRR program were more aware of whether there were disaster plans in place at their home and school, and the majority reported that they had learned a range of different response and self-protection skills. And we found that both teachers and caregivers identified schools and teachers as an important information source about hazards. So as an example, all students said that they saw their teachers as an information source about hazards and risk reduction, and 81% of parents said the same. And so if we just look at a couple of graphs as examples, the graph on the left looks at communication and action related to disaster risk reduction. And so we can see that the majority of children and caregivers talked and or acted with their family and with their friends in terms of actions related to disaster risk reduction. And almost half of the students and caregivers had talked or acted with their teacher or school community to reduce risks. However, a far lower percentage had talked or acted with the local disaster management committee. And so this graph really highlights, the information sharing and action taking together with family and friends, but it also shows the importance of schools in this area. And the graph on the right looks at risk reduction and response preparedness for earthquakes, and these are the responses from the intervention group, so students and caregivers who had participated in a risk reduction program. And this highlights the difference in responses between caregivers and students, and it's something that we found in each of the 3 testing sites. And so in this graph, we can see that far more students said they didn't know whether response preparedness actions had been taken compared to caregivers. And next, the toolkit was tested in India, and this is a larger sample. So in this sample, there were 160 students, 160 caregivers, and 53 teachers from 5 regions. That includes a mixture of rural and urban settings. And in the intervention group, so the group that had participated in a DRR program, and there were 110 students. So from the toolkit, from using the toolkit, we found that students who had participated in a risk reduction program talked about hazards and risks more often and with more people, and more often took action with their family, friends, and their teachers and schools. We also found that students who had participated in the program identified more hazards in their home, school, and community compared to students in the control group, which suggests they may have greater awareness of the hazards around them. We found that students who had participated in the program were more likely to know about or have a disaster plan at home, and they were also more likely to have participated in making the disaster plans at home. And so we found that 85% of students in the intervention group knew that there was a disaster plan at home, compared with only 5% in the control group. And we also found that students reported that they had taken more preparedness, risk reduction, and response measures, and were more aware of standard operating procedures than students in the control group. And so, for example, 82% of students who had participated in a program had practiced building evacuations at home, whereas none of the students in the control group had done that. And so to just look at a couple of graphs again, the graph on the left shows or compares students' knowledge about DRR, or students' perceptions of their knowledge about DRR between the intervention group and the control group. So students in the intervention group were most confident about their knowledge about what they can do to be safe at school. Many of them wanted more information on the skills that they need in case of hazard impact, and skills that they can use to reduce hazards around their home and community. In contrast, students in the control group reported that they had some knowledge about the hazards that they faced in their community, but the vast majority of them wanted to know more about what they can do to reduce hazards, how to be safe at school, and the skills they need in case of hazard impact. And the graph on the right shows time spent seeking and sharing disaster risk reduction information, and again compares the control group and the intervention group. And so we can see that in the control group, about 60% of them hadn't spent any time seeking or sharing information about disaster risk reduction, whereas only 5% of students in the intervention group said the same. In fact, in the intervention group, 65% said that they'd spent more than 10 hours seeking or sharing disaster risk reduction information in the past 6 months. And so I think that's, a really interesting finding that shows some of the impacts of the DRR programs. And lastly, from me, we did some focus groups with the staff or the research teams in China and India who use this toolkit, and got some feedback from them on how that process went. So the staff talked about that they really enjoyed the process overall, and that found doing research really valuable. They said that the process of the survey tool development, localizing it, translating it and testing it worked really well. And they felt that teachers, students and caregivers understood the questions they were being asked. And they also talked about that they enjoyed learning how other stakeholders like teachers understand disaster risk reduction. And they found that people in the control group were really keen to learn more about DRR. And so that really shows that just by using the toolkit, it can help to build awareness and raise interest in these topics. And overall, people talked about how having a toolkit like this will help them to tell the story of their programs with concrete data and evidence, and help them to understand if their work is achieving its goals. Some of the key challenges or issues that were found when using the toolkit were time and budget. So time to localize the toolkit, to translate it, to collect data, to familiarize or to train the team on how to use the toolkit. And having enough time and budget to support that was a really critical issue. Translation was mentioned a few times because the toolkit had to be translated into many different languages. And so one of the issues that came up is, keeping the intent of the question while translating it into language that's appropriate for children, and also keeping the intent of responses when translating them back into English. And the length of the toolkit was also mentioned. So in terms of, building this into or integrating this into daily practice or regular practice, the length of the toolkit is a challenge because it's quite lengthy. And so some suggestions and recommendations that came through were to have more time for localizing and data collection, and to also collect qualitative data, because sometimes having the stories and the quotes can be really meaningful and help to illustrate and validate the numbers that come through from the survey responses. It was also suggested to extend the use of the toolkit out to the community level, or to include the wider school community, or to consider how teachers, the extent to which teachers also do disaster risk reduction work at home. It was also suggested that the toolkit findings can be used as part of advocacy for CCDRR, and to really tell the story of the programs and how effective they are. And it was also suggested that we could perhaps develop sections that can be extracted and used when relevant, so that the toolkit can be used more regularly. And I think that's it from me, so I'll hand back over to Marla.
Okay, and I've got a few more slides, so Kate's going to put those back up. I think one of the interesting things for me coming out of the findings that Maddie just described to us is that, we've been quite focused on children with, and perhaps rather underestimating the caregivers. Certainly the children coming home with this is stimulating conversation at the family level, but I think I'm rather happy to see that, and at least this is consistent in both China and in India, where we had these control groups and so forth, that, adults are taking on the role of duty bearers as we would hope and expect that they do. So indeed, they know more about what's been done at the household level, and and they seem also to be active participants in this, which is somewhat of a relief. And I think, that really also helps us to come back to this differentiation that we've made along the way, which is that we're really promoting child-centered risk reduction as opposed to child-led and putting this all on the shoulders of the children. to succeed or not. Let's take a look at some of the recommendations that have come out of this process. There's a number of them. Of course, I think the underlying all of them is really that the toolkit seems to have been quite valuable. I think that as we allow Bangladesh, China, and India in particular to analyze and look more closely at their results, that they will find that there are some really nice indications of the positive impacts that their programs are having. But we also see that we really need to design our projects with some experimental aspects where we are really kind of focusing in on the activities that we're trying to use, looking for being able to describe these activities, first of all, and ultimately what we want to do is find the most effective and cost-efficient and time-efficient mix of activities that will accomplish the same things. It's not really a trick to be able to say that if we have a full-time community mobilizer working with one school, 3 days a week for 6 months or a year, that they're going to be better off than if they didn't have that. That's super. But when it comes to what we have to do, which is to achieve impact at scale and do something that is measurable, achievable, and can be replicated, and doesn't cost the earth, and is not hugely labor intensive, then we really have the onus is on us to find that mix of interventions that is the most effective. So, there are potentially dozens of questions around, is it better to learn about things in the classroom, or should we go straight to doing drills and small mitigation projects with kids? Is it better to teach them things in their textbooks and the curriculum, or is it better to involve them in voluntary projects? Can we communicate the same information in a take-home family disaster plan that, that's been designed by Illustrator A or designed by Illustrator B? Does the one that has more words and more description have resonance, or does the other one have better resonance? So, I think really we've got to, this is going to push us to raise the bar on how we describe our program activities and how we measure and test which ones are really responsible for the impact. Certainly, we've also demonstrated, and we can highly recommend, that practitioners can be active partners in research. I mean, for me, perhaps the most delightful finding of all was the one that Maddie just said, that our program teams enjoyed doing the research. And this was something they were perhaps not expecting, had maybe never really fully been asked to do in the past, and got them thinking, really grappling with some of these issues. So I'm incredibly encouraged by that. By the same token, I mean, we haven't gotten to it, but to the same extent that we can involve practitioners as active partners in research, we can also then move to involving children and youth and community members as active partners in research. We recommend that we approach this as an iterative tool, that it's going to be both a template as well as adapted at the country level. And so as we adapt at the country level, we should try to find a way of also continuously updating and improving the template so that the next country to come along will benefit from all of the combined experience. We also think that because this is pretty labor intensive and it may not be feasible to do this at the same level at 2 or 3 points along the program, that we should probably pull out shorter subsets of questions that can be implemented more frequently. So it's not maybe necessary that every single question be asked. And that's just something we didn't have time to go through on this go round. Let's see what else we've got on the next slide. This toolkit at the moment has focused on kind of quantitative methods using the surveys, which is all well and good. But in some cases, well, in many cases, really, we just didn't have the richness and detail to know what some of those things meant. And I think everyone felt that they would have liked to have some interviews and focus group discussions where they really could have gotten examples to ground truth the findings and to be able to really describe and give some richness to what these things mean. So that's something that we should be easily able to add into the next iteration of the toolkit. Those additional methods will produce stories about risk reduction and resilience or key lessons that can be shared. And I think it's probably something that can be combined with a case study storytelling approach, which is to get our antennas up. And when we hear about something that's taken place that we think is exemplary, we really kind of take a deep breath, stop, and document that really, really well right then and there with, whip out your camera, take the photos, get the release signed, make sure you know the name of the person and how to reach them and all of those things. So this will become a bit more second nature to us. The toolkit should definitely be used minimally 2 times at the beginning and at the end of a project, but in a longer project, ideally, we would be able to use it as a monitoring tool along the way. It would be ideal to sort of use it in more locations with a broader sample size. The larger the sample size, the better statistical analysis we're able to implement. And so as we went along and went from Bangladesh to China to India, our sample size increased along the way, and you can see the results in the reporting. And future uses of the toolkit, we certainly know that we need to put in sufficient time to translate, localize, and contextualize, sufficient budget not only for data collection. Some of our offices have the capability and have people on staff who can throw all this up into a Survey Monkey or similar thing so that this can be really easily collected out in the field by the enumerators, and that's great. But that sort of thing needs to be budgeted in, and then we also probably, we absolutely have to budget in the time of some of our program quality or meal support staff, or in some cases consultants, to do the kind of analysis that we need. I've already mentioned splitting it up, and the translation of the tool is challenging. It's all very well that the program staff understands what we're talking about, but in particular, when you're working with your control group who hasn't been exposed to the language at all, you obviously, eyes can open wide when you ask questions that includes words that, just are not making a lot of sense. So it might be interesting to try to do some iconography and graphics and vary the question types and see if there are some more kind of fun and appealing ways of posing the questions. And then the other thing that we, are not able to do this time, but I think it's really important in the future that we be prepared to do a public-facing report. Maybe it's just 4 pages long to report back on the research results, and we could probably put that into some nice reporting templates so that those could be easily generated in the course of the project. And that really, demonstrates both our ethical commitment to the beneficiary community, as well as reinforcing the value of the research, in an iterative way. Do we have any more? And so that the research be looked at as not just an extractive tool, but also as a pedagogic tool. So we've whipped through that, hopefully with time for discussion.
Thanks, Marla. So now it's over to everyone here, all the attendees. You've got both Marla and Matalina here, so feel free to ask any questions or any comments. Does someone want to kick us off? And you're more than welcome to use the microphone as well. You're just all on mute at the moment, so you just need to unmute your microphone. Asan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentations, all of you. So I have, I think, a very good initiative, I think, indeed, for Save the Children. And I have specifically, I have 3 areas where I have like to emphasize that we are talking about child-centered. Today's this thing is like child-centered DRR toolkits, but it's to me like more of like a school-based students DRR toolkit. So considering the terminology, would it be very good to say use rather than child-centered like school students risk reduction toolkits? That is one thing, because when we are talking about child-centered, it are also talking about the community. To me, like it tested only in the schools, not in the overall the students, the children who are living in the community. They are not addressed by this research. This is one thing. Secondly, when you're talking about children, I think we have to also consider the age, which age we are considering, because children, they are below 18, all the children. So which age group we are talking specifically? That is another issue. And also, like, we are from Save the Children, it is my general feelings that we are like proposing this toolkit for the students in the schools and the communities to practice, certainly for their well-being and safety, but also we have to like thinking about the content and the volume, because in my country, in Bangladesh, I can say that my children are already overloaded. It's too many school-based curriculum. So if we like try to add more things, certainly this is beneficial, but how to integrate those issues, it is very, I think, important to consider. So initially, these are the area I want to flag. Thank you.
Kate, I think, do you want me to take up some of these, and while other people are thinking of mulling things over as well? I think, Asan, you're quite right that this was really focused on school-based, and you're right that we should clarify that before rolling it out. I think though that it could be very well easily adapted to programs that are not school-based, but are implementing community-based activities. At least the household impact side of it, where we're really seeking particular changes at the household level, would still be applicable. And so, that what would essentially be different, and it needs to be different in any case, is, what the activities are. So in the schools, we may have known what the list of activities were that we theoretically started out from, and we may not have as clear a list of activities for the community-based, but that can certainly be developed. And I mean, again, I think, no matter what, these toolkits, when we go into the localization and adaptation process, I think it could be quite context specific. So let's say, you're working in urban slums, and let's just say that in urban slums, we know that fire hazards are a particular issue. And we may know that the cause of some of those fires are cooking indoors under very crowded conditions, or not having your fire extinguishing bucket of sand or something nearby. And so if those are 2 things that we're targeting, which is don't cook indoors and make sure you have your fire suppression equipment nearby, then we would, of course, also want to make sure that those 2 things get measured when it comes to the household impacts, right? So, I mean, these at the moment are sort of at the level of anecdote, but I guess I would just, put it out and see what you think, that in principle, this tool could be adapted for community-based work. I mean, you wouldn't do the teacher interview. You would, instead of interviewing teachers, you would interview the local community organizers, let's say, or mobilizers. And age groups, yes, you're quite right. I mean, the age groups across the three programs were, I think, consistently somewhere between third or fourth grade and sixth grade. But of course, you know, that's because it seems like all the programs are targeting those age groups. But we can get a lot more specific about, you know, differentiating what can be done with different age groups. I think that's a great point. And as to children overloaded, yeah, well, that one we definitely are aware of and agree, and that's part of why some of this has to come out in ways other than, you know, packing it into the curriculum. I guess the more I see of this, the less I care about packing it into curriculum, even though, you know, many governments are asking for support in integration into the curriculum. I mean, there are some things, of course, that can and should go into curriculum, but I don't know that we're ever going to get the kind of long-term funding that we need to follow that idea through. So it just doesn't seem all that practical.
And Mala, there's also a question here about if you can comment on the experience with the gender angle, so boys and girls in the countries that tested the tool.
I don't think we did any gender analysis at all on yeah, Maddie.
Yeah. So for each site in general, there were very few differences in the responses from male and female caregivers and students. One that did come through in the India test, though, was that both male children and male parents and caregivers tended to be more confident that they would be safe during a disaster than women or girls. But otherwise, there were very few differences that were recorded between male and female responses.
So that's probably good news for our programming. I mean, it means that we've equally reached the girls and the boys.
And
I'm just guessing that the differences in confidence are also something to be somewhat welcomed. It's always good to have some members of the family be a little bit less confident than others.
And great to see so many new names on the call, and I apologise if I get your names wrong. Please correct me. I can see that, is it Mostak would like to make some comments, so please feel free to use your microphone.
Yeah, thank you for your good presentation. I think it was nice to join in this conversation and understanding what is going on. I mean, when I joined with Save the Children when we went go live in Bangladesh in October 2011, after that it was one of the realization was that the TRR sector was somehow neglected in Save the Children. We were talking many things about disaster preparedness, risk reduction, but it was missing some kind of, leader or, guardian, something like that. But this toolkit, when I see that, it's good news that at least something is happening in child-centered DRR program, which actually is encouraging me that, yes, we should go ahead with this. I have a couple of my observation. One is mindset. I mean, generally people, I'm not sure about other countries, but in Bangladesh I can say that generally people has this mindset is that children as a whole, they are not able to understand disaster risk reduction, preparedness issues, and then they cannot bear the load of this, as well as Hassan was talking about, that extracurricular load. We had to fight in Bangladesh to make people understand that no, these are the children who has some certain age group and will be able to understand disaster risk reduction, and they can use that knowledge in terms of their family preparedness, school preparedness. So this was a great chance, but nowadays it has been changed. So somehow, I don't know, this is a indication for the whole participants, for the whole children in around the countries, across the countries of different parts of the world, that how we can work together to change the mindset of the not only the people in general, but guardians, everybody, teachers, everybody. Secondly, I think that how we are perceiving that children will be acting as an agent between between school and in the society. We were working in different child-centered DRR program, and at the beginning, what I understood from him before 5-7 years, that there was child-led DRR program, which was not that much successful because of the children working with the community was a big challenge at that time. So later on, we changed the thematic area in the sense that it should be child-centered or child-focused DRR program. So my recommendation would be that the toolkit should be aiming to focus on children as a participant in the center of DRR work, not taking the full load of changing the society in terms of disaster preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mostak. Marla or Madalena, did you have any comments to respond to that?
No, I think quite right. That's, good observations.
And I can see that Manish has asked if there's any rubrics or guidelines to train the investigator on these toolkit.
Yes, there is. The toolkit itself contains substantial guidance, and I think it could be implemented by, any one of our, capable program quality and evaluation folks could help, as long as you have somebody on board with the, child-centered DRR expertise, as I think we now have, in each of our countries. So, I think it should be fairly easy to run with. We'll find out, I think, as we share this a bit more widely.
And the toolkit is in the last stages of just being reviewed and signed off on, so we'll be able to share it more widely very soon. If you keep an eye on the Education Safe from Disasters workplace page, as well as the Safe Schools workplace page, which I can share the link to that on this group. If you join up to that, we'll be sharing all of the research through there as well. I can see we've got a couple of minutes left. Does anyone have any further questions or comments? No, I think that's all. Marla, Madalena, did you have any final comments or questions you'd like to ask people?
Well, really appreciate folks being on board here. JC, I know you've got a student interested in this. We'd love to have students engaged in this process with us and helping us sort of roll the ball forward. So we hope to hear more about that. And any of you from any of our country offices that are interested, you will be getting this soon, but feel free to drop me a line, if you're interested in giving it a try.
Thanks, Mara. JC here.
Thank you. And also for all of those who have joined at the start, I just asked people to put their name, their organisation and the country they're joining from just in the chat box. So if you haven't done so already, if you could do that, that would really help us out, just with knowing who to share things with and for a record on who joined the webinar. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today and for the discussion afterwards. And to Marla and Madalena, thank you very much for the research and the presentation. It was very informative and I really enjoyed that, as I can see a lot of people are writing comments saying they did as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.